The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. A sleepy summary. Let the candle burn low, because tonight's story is a quiet one, a slow one, the kind that unfolds like fog easing over a still lake. It is the story of a small, careful, endlessly patient man named Immanuel Kant, who lived his whole life in a cold little town called Königsberg, who never travelled more than a few miles from his own front door, and who nevertheless decided, one winter, to go looking for the edges of the human mind, not the edges of the world. Not the edges of the stars, though he loved the stars, and he loved them so much that later he would say the starry sky above him and the moral law within him were the two things that filled his heart with ever new and ever-increasing wonder. No, what Kant went looking for was something stranger and quieter than the stars. He wanted to know what a mind can know, and what a mind can never know, no matter how long it thinks, no matter how bright its candle burns. So let's drift into his library together, where the shelves are heavy with old books and the fire is just barely glowing, and let's listen to how he told it. Kant begins in his preface with a small and rather sad complaint. He says that human reason has a peculiar fate. It keeps being troubled by questions it cannot avoid because they come to it naturally from the very nature of reason itself, and yet it also cannot answer them because they lie beyond all its powers. Reason, he says, falls into this difficulty through no fault of its own. It asks about the soul, about freedom, about God, about the beginning of the world, and every time it asks, it starts building higher and higher, tower upon tower of argument, the way children stack blocks in the dark without quite being able to see what they are doing. And every time, eventually, the tower falls. Metaphysics, which used to be called the queen of all the sciences, has become, Kant says with a kind of weary tenderness, a battlefield of endless controversies, a land where nobody ever really wins, where the wisest despair and the boldest simply help themselves to bits of the wreckage. He looks out at his own century and sees indifference settling over philosophy like dust, settling over unread books. And he says gently that this indifference is not shallow or careless. It's actually a symptom of maturity. People have stopped believing that pure speculation, unchecked and unexamined, can ever really settle these old grand questions. And this, Kant says, this is exactly why we need what he is about to attempt. Not another tower, a different kind of task altogether. Before reason builds anything else, he says, it must first turn around and examine itself. It must put itself on trial. It must become its own judge and ask calmly, patiently, with the same rigor a careful judge would use on anyone else. What exactly are you capable of, dear reason? What can you rightfully claim to know? And where, precisely, must you learn to fall silent? This self-examination is what Kant calls a critique. Not a critique in the sense of an attack, not a tearing down, but a critique in the sense of a careful survey, an inventory, a mapping of a territory, so that afterward nobody wanders into swampland by mistake and calls it solid ground. And here Kant makes the move that everyone remembers, even people who have never read another word of his. The move he compares, almost playfully, to the revolution Copernicus once made in astronomy. For centuries, astronomers had assumed that the heavens revolved around a still and stationary observer around us, around the Earth, and the calculations kept getting more and more tangled, epicycle piled on epicycle, until Copernicus tried something almost absurd. What if the observer moves and the sun stays still? Suddenly the tangles fell away, and the motion of the stars finally made sense. Kant proposes the same reversal, but turned inward toward knowledge itself. Until now, he says, philosophers assumed that all our knowledge must conform to the objects out there, patiently waiting in the world, and our minds simply receive them, like a soft piece of wax receiving the shape of a seal. But this assumption, tried over and over, kept leading to failure, kept leading nowhere, kept leaving reason unable to explain how we could know anything at all with certainty and necessity, especially in mathematics, where somehow we seem to know things before we've even looked, purely by thinking. So Kant asks, what if it's the other way around? What if, instead, objects must conform to the structure of our knowing? What if the mind is not a passive wax tablet at all, but something more like a lamp, casting its own particular shape of light over whatever it touches, so that everything we can ever experience already comes wearing the shape our mind gave it? This is the quiet, world-turning suggestion at the heart of the whole book. And once you feel its shape, you can drift through the rest of Kant's long, careful argument almost as though you already know where each hallway leads. Now, before wandering further into the house, Kant wants us to understand a distinction, a soft but crucial one, and he asks us to hold it gently in our sleepy hands like two different kinds of stones. On one side, there are judgments that are analytic. In an analytic judgment, the predicate is already secretly folded inside the subject, the way the idea of having three sides is already folded inside the idea of triangle. To say a triangle has three sides tells you nothing new. It simply unfolds what was already there, like unfolding a paper you'd already written on. Analytic judgments are certain, yes, necessarily true, but they are also, in a sense, empty. They add nothing to our stock of knowledge. On the other side, there are judgments that are synthetic. In a synthetic judgment, the predicate adds something genuinely new to the subject, something not contained in it merely by definition. To say the stone is warm adds real information you couldn't have gotten from the mere concept of stone. Most synthetic judgments, Kant says, come from experience, from a posteriori knowledge gathered after going out into the world and looking. But here is the puzzle that keeps Kant awake at night, the question that will not let him rest, the one all the previous chapters have simply been clearing throat space for. There seem to be some judgments that are both synthetic, genuinely adding new information, and yet also a priori, known before and independent of any particular experience, known with a strange, absolute necessity that mere experience could never provide. Take mathematics. 7 plus 5 equals 12. Kant argues this is not merely analytic. If you carefully examine the bare concept of 7 and the bare concept of 5, you will not find the concept of 12 hidden inside, not without actually performing, in intuition, the act of counting, of adding, one thing after another. And yet it is also known with total certainty, prior to any experience, true not just of the coins on your nightstand, but of every possible 7 and 5 anywhere, always. Or take a proposition like every event has a cause. We don't merely define event as a thing that has a cause, and yet we seem to know with iron necessity that this must be true of anything we could ever experience, not simply that it has always so far been true. How Kant asks, his voice hushed now, almost a whisper into the dark, how is such a thing even possible? How can the mind reach out before experience and know something true and new about experience? This single question, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible, is the seed the entire enormous tree of the critique grows from. Everything after this is Kant slowly, patiently, chapter by chapter, tracing that seed down into roots and up into branches. And now, drifting a little further into the dim rooms of the book, we come to the first great hall Kant built, which he calls the transcendental aesthetic. Don't let the word aesthetic confuse you, half asleep as you are. He doesn't mean beauty here, he means the study of sensibility, the study of how things are given to us at all, before any thinking even begins. And in this hall, Kant makes a claim that startled his own century and still startles readers now, drowsy or not. He argues that space and time are not things we discover out there in the world, the way you might discover a chair or a tree or a distant lighthouse. Space and time, he says, are not properties of things in themselves. They are instead the very forms of our own sensibility, the spectacles, if you like, that we cannot take off, built permanently into the architecture of our own minds, through which alone anything can appear to us at all. Nothing can ever be given to us through the senses except as located somewhere in space, and nothing can ever be given to us except as occurring at some moment in time. But this, Kant argues, is not because space and time are grand containers floating out there independently, waiting to hold objects the way an empty room waits to hold furniture. And it is also not because space and time are just vague general concepts we've slowly abstracted, one experience at a time, the way we might abstract the concept, redness, from many red things we've seen. No. Space, Kant argues, must be presupposed before we can locate any particular thing at all. You cannot arrive at the representation of space by comparing many outer experiences, because you already needed space in order to have any outer experience whatsoever, in order for anything to appear outside you or beside something else. Space is a pure intuition, given whole and prior, not built up piece by piece. And you can imagine empty space, space with nothing at all inside it, but you cannot imagine the total absence of space itself. It is, in Kant's gentle but firm phrase, the necessary a priori form of all outer appearances. Time works the same way, only deeper still, because time is the form not just of outer appearances, but of our inner life as well, of the whole passing procession of our thoughts and feelings, one after another, following each other through the soft corridor of the mind. Even outer appearances, since we must represent them to ourselves, ultimately pass through the form of time too. And so time turns out to be, for Kant, the most fundamental form of all, the deepest, quietest riverbed through which every experience we could ever have must eventually flow. And here is why this matters so much, why Kant lingers so long in this drowsy hall before moving on. If space and time are forms contributed by our own minds rather than features belonging to things exactly as they are in themselves, then it explains, at last, how geometry and arithmetic can be both synthetic, genuinely informative, and also a priori, known with total necessity before experience. Because when a geometer studies the properties of triangles or circles, they are not reading facts off of some independent triangle sitting out there in the world. They are exploring the necessary structure of space itself, the very medium through which they intuit anything at all, a medium they carry with them inside their own minds, wherever they go. Mathematics, in other words, is certain not because it describes distant objects with miraculous accuracy, but because it describes the very shape of the window through which all objects must appear to us. And here Kant's voice grows a little more solemn, a little more careful. There is a price to this explanation, a price he does not shy away from, though it is a heavy one to carry into sleep. If space and time are only the forms of our sensibility, only how things appear to us, then we can never, through the senses, know things as they are utterly in themselves, apart from the way our own minds necessarily shape them. Kant calls the thing as it appears to us, wrapped in space and time, the phenomenon, and he calls the thing as it might be, apart from all our forms of receiving it, the noumenon, or the thing in itself. This is not, Kant insists, some sad skeptical trick, not a claim that the world is an illusion. The phenomena are perfectly real, real in the only sense real could ever mean for a knowing creature like us. But it does mean that human knowledge, however far it reaches, only ever reaches appearances, never the naked thing behind them. And with that thought hanging softly in the air like a held breath, we leave the transcendental aesthetic behind and move deeper into the house. The next great hall is larger, more intricate, full of winding little passages, and Kant calls it the transcendental logic. If the aesthetic was about sensibility, about how things are given to us through our receptive faculty, the logic is about understanding, about how those given things are then thought, organized, and known. Kant offers us a small saying here to hold on to as we go, a saying that sounds almost like a lullaby of its own. Thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. Meaning our senses alone give us a flood of raw material, scattered, formless, a kind of blooming, buzzing confusion of the given. But this raw material, all by itself, could never add up to knowledge of anything. And our concepts alone, without anything given to apply them to, would be nothing but empty forms, spinning uselessly in the dark. Real knowledge requires both hands working together, the receiving hand of sensibility and the organizing hand of understanding, folded around each other like two hands folded in prayer, or more sleepily, like two hands folded together on a pillow. Within this hall, Kant first walks us through what he calls the transcendental analytic, and here he goes hunting for the pure concepts of the understanding, the concepts he calls the categories. Just as space and time were pure forms belonging to sensibility rather than borrowed from experience, Kant argues that the understanding, too, brings its own pure concepts to the table, concepts not abstracted from experience, but rather presupposed by it, necessary for experience to be experience at all. He finds his list of categories, a little methodically, almost the way a librarian finds books by consulting a catalogue, by looking at the basic logical forms of judgment itself. Wherever human thought judges anything at all, he says, it must judge according to quantity, quality, relation, and modality, and under each of these 4 headings there are 3 further categories, giving us 12 in total. Things like unity, plurality, and totality under quantity. Reality, negation, and limitation under quality. Substance, causality, and community under relation. And possibility, existence, and necessity under modality. These are not concepts we happen to learn from watching enough substances and enough causes go by in the world. Rather, Kant argues, they are the very structures the mind must use in order to turn a mere raw flood of sensation into a coherent, connected experience of objects at all. Without the category of substance, for instance, we would never even be able to think of anything as an enduring thing that persists through change. Without the category of cause, we would never be able to think of one event as following necessarily from another, rather than merely happening to come after it, the way night simply happens to follow day, without night being caused by day. But here Kant pauses and asks himself the hardest and most important question of the whole first half of the book. By what right do we assume that these categories, which come from the mind's own nature, must actually apply to the objects we experience? Just because my mind is built to think in terms of substance and cause, why should the world, or even the mere appearances given to me, cooperate and actually be structured that way? This is the great problem Kant calls the transcendental deduction, and he wrote it, revised it, and rewrote it more than once, worrying over it the way someone worries over a knot they cannot quite work loose in the dim evening light. His answer, when it finally comes, is subtle and deep, and it goes something like this. Any experience at all, in order to count as experience of a unified world rather than a meaningless, disconnected string of impressions, requires that all these many representations be bound together, synthesized, gathered up under a single, continuous self, a single, I think, that could, in principle, accompany every one of them. Kant calls this the transcendental unity of apperception, this deep, quiet thread of self-awareness running underneath and through all our representations, stitching them into one coherent experience belonging to one single subject. But he argues, this binding together, this synthesis, cannot happen automatically or by accident. It requires rules, and the categories are precisely those rules, the necessary patterns according to which any manifold of intuition must be combined if it is ever to become the unified experience of a single self-conscious mind. In other words, the categories apply to appearances, because it is only by applying them that scattered sensory data can ever become a coherent experience belonging to a unified I in the first place. The categories are not borrowed from objects. They are, in a very real sense, what first makes objects, as objects of experience, possible for us at all. Once this deep and difficult argument is laid down, Kant moves to something a little more approachable, something almost like a bridge, which he calls the schematism. He notices a small but real difficulty. The categories are pure, abstract, intellectual concepts, entirely general, while our intuitions, given through space and time, are always particular, sensory, concrete. How can such different kinds of things ever connect? His answer is that time itself provides the bridge, because time, as we heard earlier, belongs to both realms at once, being both the form of inner sense, connected to thought, and the medium through which all appearances, even outer ones, must ultimately be represented. So for each category, Kant finds a corresponding schema, a rule for how that category gets applied specifically in time. The schema of substance, for example, is permanence of the real in time. The schema of cause is the rule by which one thing regularly and necessarily follows another according to a rule in succession through time. These schemata are like little translators standing at the border between pure thought and lived, temporal experience, letting the abstract categories finally reach down and organize the flowing sensory world. With the schemata in hand, Kant then lays out what he calls the principles of pure understanding, a set of very general rules, one corresponding to each group of categories that govern all possible experience. Under the axioms of intuition, he argues that all appearances, as intuitions, are extensive magnitudes, meaning every appearance can be measured out, part by part, the way you can measure a length by adding smaller lengths together. Under the anticipations of perception, he argues that every real thing that fills space and time has intensive magnitude, meaning it has some degree, some greater or lesser intensity, and this is something we can actually know in advance, before ever perceiving any particular thing, simply because everything that appears to the senses must appear with some degree of intensity or other. Under the analogies of experience, the ones many readers find most beautiful, Kant argues for three deep principles. First, that throughout all change substance persists, and the total quantity of substance in nature is neither increased nor diminished, only rearranged. Second, that every alteration happens according to the law of cause and effect, so that nothing simply happens without something else, according to a rule making it happen. And third, that all substances, insofar as they can be perceived as coexisting in space, stand in thoroughgoing community, in mutual interaction with one another, each influencing and being influenced by the rest. And under the postulates of empirical thought, Kant distinguishes carefully between what is merely possible, what is actual, and what is strictly necessary, always relative to the conditions under which experience itself is possible. Tucked into this section, almost like a small quiet room off the main hallway, Kant also offers something he calls a refutation of idealism, aimed gently but firmly at those philosophers who doubted whether we could even be sure that anything existed outside our own minds at all. Kant argues, somewhat surprisingly, that our very consciousness of our own existence in time, something even the doubting idealist cannot deny, already requires something permanent outside us, in relation to which alone we could ever measure the passage of our inner states. In other words, even the innermost certainty of the thinking self quietly depends on there being an outer world of enduring things. It's a lovely, sleepy little twist. The doubt turns out, on close inspection, to secretly need the very thing it doubted. Having built up this whole intricate structure, this whole lattice of categories, schemata, and principles, Kant pauses to remind us, gently but insistently, of the boundary he drew all the way back in the aesthetic. All of this magnificent apparatus, he says, this whole architecture of the understanding, only ever has legitimate use when applied to appearances, to objects as they can be given to us in space and time through sensible intuition. The categories, applied beyond this boundary, applied to things utterly independent of any possible experience, to noumena, to things in themselves, produce nothing but empty, illegitimate thought, thought without any content to secure it, like a ship sailing off the edge of a map into waters no compass could ever chart. This is a crucial hushed warning because it sets up everything still to come. In an appendix to this section, Kant also gently corrects an old philosophical confusion he calls the amphiboly of the concepts of reflection, showing how earlier thinkers, particularly the great rationalist Leibniz, sometimes confused mere concepts of thought, entirely intellectual, with actual properties of things given in sensible intuition, mixing together two different sources of knowledge as though they were one, and thereby wandering without quite realizing it. Past the very boundary Kant has just so carefully marked out. And so now, drowsy traveller, we step out of the well-lit, orderly halls of the analytic, where reason, kept carefully within its proper boundary, could actually achieve real, secure knowledge, and we walk instead into a much stranger, much darker, much more haunted wing of the house, the one Kant calls the transcendental dialectic. Here reason, unable to help itself, reaches out beyond all possible experience, and here Kant sets out to explain patiently, almost sympathetically, why it does this, and why it always gets itself into trouble when it does. Kant explains that reason has a natural tendency, almost a kind of hunger, to seek the unconditioned, to seek some final, complete ground or totality that would let a chain of conditions finally come to rest. Given any conditioned thing, reason instinctively asks after its condition, and then the condition of that condition, and so on, and it cannot rest satisfied until it reaches something unconditioned, some final resting point that needs no further condition beyond itself. This hunger produces what Kant calls the ideas of pure reason, three great, majestic, and he argues ultimately unanswerable ideas: the soul, as the absolute unconditioned unity of the thinking subject, the world as the absolute unconditioned totality of all conditions, of the whole causal and spatial series of appearances, and God as the absolute unconditioned ground of all possibility, the most real being, the condition of all conditions. These ideas are not illegitimate simply for existing. Reason cannot help producing them. They arise naturally, almost inevitably, out of its own deepest structure. The illegitimacy comes only when reason mistakes these ideas for objects of possible knowledge, when it forgets that they can never be given in any possible experience, and tries to prove things about them the same way it proves things about appearances within experience. This mistaking, Kant says, produces what he calls transcendental illusion, and he is careful, almost tender, in noting that this illusion, unlike an ordinary mistake, cannot simply be corrected once and dispelled forever. It belongs permanently to the very nature of human reason, the way an optical illusion continues to look bent even after you know, with total certainty, that the stick in the water is actually straight. Kant then walks us, room by room, through the three great fantasies reason falls into when it chases each of these ideas too far. First comes what he calls the paralogisms of pure reason, the mistaken arguments of what was then called rational psychology, the old attempt to prove through pure reasoning alone that the soul is a simple, indivisible substance, that it is numerically identical through time, that it is a genuine person, and that it might, therefore, survive independently of the body, perhaps forever. Kant walks through these arguments with real patience, and shows, again and again, that they all share the same hidden flaw. They mistake the merely logical unity of the I think, the bare formal unity required for any thought to be my thought at all, for the real, substantial, knowable unity of an actual persisting thing. From the fact that all my thoughts must be capable of being accompanied by one single I, it does not follow that I have thereby gained any positive knowledge about what that I really is in itself, as an object, whether it is simple, whether it is a substance, whether it will endure. The rational psychologist, Kant says gently, has confused the subject of thought with an object of thought, and no amount of clever argument can bridge that gap using reason alone. Then comes the far grander and more dramatic whole, the one Kant calls the antinomies of pure reason, where reason, trying to grasp the world as an unconditioned totality, gets tangled in four separate pairs of arguments, each pair consisting of a thesis and an antithesis, each side arguing with what looks like equal, airtight rigor, and yet each pair contradicting the other completely. In the first antinomy, one voice argues that the world must have had a beginning in time and must be limited in space, because otherwise an infinite series would already have had to be completed before now, which is impossible. While the other voice argues with equal force that the world can have had no beginning and no spatial limit, because to imagine a beginning is to imagine an empty time before it, in which nothing happens, and nothing could ever explain why the world began at one moment rather than another. In the second antinomy, One voice argues that every composite substance is made of simple, indivisible parts, while the other argues that nothing simple exists anywhere, that everything is endlessly divisible forever. In the third antinomy, one voice argues that besides the strict causal laws of nature, there must also be a kind of causality through freedom. An uncaused first cause, or nothing, could ever really explain the whole chain from its beginning, while the other voice argues that freedom is impossible, that nature is a seamless fabric of cause following cause, and if freedom really interrupted that fabric, nature's own lawful unity would be destroyed. And in the fourth antinomy, one voice argues that there must exist, somewhere, as part of the world or as its cause, an absolutely necessary being, while the other argues that no such necessary being could exist anywhere, either within the world or outside it. Kant's resolution here, when it finally comes, is one of the loveliest and most surprising turns in the whole book, and it depends entirely on the discovery he made all the way back in the Aesthetic. He argues that in the first two antinomies, called the mathematical antinomies, both the thesis and the antithesis are actually false, because both sides secretly assume that the world, as an infinite whole existing independently in itself, is a legitimate object for our reason to have opinions about, when in fact, since space and time are only forms of our own sensibility, the world as a whole totality is not simply given to us anywhere, complete and finished, waiting to be measured as finite or infinite. The question, asked that way, is simply based on a false premise from the start, like asking whether an imaginary friend is taller or shorter than you. Both answers are equally empty. But in the last two antinomies, called the dynamical antinomies, Kant finds something gentler, something almost hopeful in the dim light. Here, he argues, both the thesis and the antithesis might actually be true, but true of different things. If we distinguish carefully between the phenomenal world, the world of appearances governed strictly by natural causal law, and the noumenal realm of things in themselves, then it becomes possible, Kant argues, for every appearance to be thoroughly determined by natural causes, exactly as the antithesis of the third antinomy demands, while at the very same time leaving room, in the realm of things in themselves, for a free, uncaused causality to exist as well, exactly as the thesis demands, without any contradiction between the two, because they are simply talking about two different aspects of the very same reality, seen from two entirely different sides. This is the famous doorway Kant opens here, quietly, almost in passing, a doorway that will matter enormously later in his moral philosophy, for it means that freedom, though it can never be proven or known theoretically, is at least not disproven, not ruled out, by anything reason can establish about the strict causal order of nature. Reason has made room, Kant says, in one of his most quietly moving lines, room enough for faith, even while it denies itself the comfort of theoretical knowledge on this point. And then, deeper still into this dim wing of the house, comes the final room, the one Kant calls the ideal of pure reason, where he turns carefully, respectfully, but without flinching, to examine the traditional arguments for the existence of God. He finds three main types of argument that philosophy had produced over the centuries, and he takes each one apart with the same patient, careful hands he's used throughout the whole book. First, the ontological argument, which tries to prove God's existence simply from the very concept of God as the most perfect being, reasoning that since existence is itself a kind of perfection, a being that lacked existence would not be the most perfect being, and so the most perfect being must exist. Kant's famous reply, quiet but devastating, is that existence is not a real predicate at all, not a property that adds anything to the concept of a thing the way redness or roundness would. To say something exists is not to add a new characteristic to its concept, but simply to say that the concept, whatever it contains, actually has an instance out there in reality. 100 real coins, Kant says, contain not the slightest bit more in their concept than 100 merely possible coins. The only difference is that the real coins actually exist, which is not itself a feature you could ever discover simply by examining a concept more closely, no matter how perfect that concept claimed to be. Second, the cosmological argument, which reasons from the mere fact that something exists to the necessity of a first cause or necessary being to explain it. Kant shows that this argument, in order to reach its conclusion, secretly has to smuggle in, at its final crucial step, the very ontological argument it claimed not to need, and so it inherits all of that argument's same flaw. And third, the physico-theological argument, or the argument from design, which reasons from the vast order, harmony, and apparent purposiveness of nature to a wise and powerful designer. Kant treats this argument with real warmth and respect, admitting that it is the oldest, clearest, and most fitted to ordinary human reason of all the proofs. But he shows that, at best, all it could ever prove is a very great and wise architect, shaping already existing material into order, never a truly infinite, all-sufficient creator who brought that material itself into being out of nothing. To reach that further, grander conclusion, this argument too, in the end, has to quietly lean on the cosmological argument, which leans, in turn, on the ontological argument, so that all three towers, however differently built, all rest, in the end, on the very same shaky, unprovable foundation. But and this matters so much to Kant that he returns to it again and again. None of this means these great ideas, the soul, the world as a totality, God, are useless or ought to be thrown away like broken toys. Even though reason can never know theoretically that they correspond to any real object, Kant argues that they still serve an enormously important regulative function, guiding reason to search for ever greater unity, ever greater systematic completeness in its knowledge of nature, urging the scientist onward as though nature were a single, complete, purposive system, even though this completeness itself can never actually be reached or confirmed. The ideas act like a distant, glowing point on the horizon, Kant suggests, something that gives inquiry its direction and its unity, even though the traveller can never actually arrive at that point and stand upon it. Now, gentle listener, we have wandered through the largest and most difficult rooms of the house, and there remains only a smaller wing, the one Kant calls the transcendental doctrine of method, quieter and more practical, almost like a closing set of instructions left on the table before the candle finally gutters out. Here Kant reflects on how pure reason ought to be disciplined, going forward, now that its true and proper boundaries have finally been mapped. In the discipline of pure reason, he warns philosophy against imitating mathematics too closely, since mathematics constructs its concepts directly in pure intuition, while philosophy can only ever analyze concepts already given to it, a much humbler, more careful task. He warns against empty polemics, arguing that once reason understands its own proper limits, philosophical disputes about what lies beyond all possible experience simply dissolve, because neither side, dogmatist or skeptic, can actually produce genuine proof, and the whole battlefield of dogmatism and dogmatic skepticism can quietly stand down. He allows a very careful, very modest role for hypotheses about the supersensible, so long as they are never mistaken for genuine knowledge, and he discusses, briefly, what kind of proofs pure reason is and is not entitled to attempt. In the canon of pure reason, he turns, with something like relief, from what pure reason cannot know to what practical reason can rightfully hope for. And here, for the first time in the whole long book, real warmth returns to his voice. He speaks of the highest good, the union of virtue and happiness, and argues that although we cannot theoretically prove the existence of God or the immortality of the soul, practical reason, the reason bound up with morality and with what we ought to do, gives us solid, rational grounds to hope for them, to have a kind of reasoned faith in them, even where theoretical knowledge must remain permanently silent. In the architectonic of pure reason, he sketches, like an old cartographer laying out a map for later generations, the whole system that this critique has now made possible, showing how metaphysics, once properly grounded and limited, could finally become an honest, secure science rather than an endless battlefield. And in the brief closing history of pure reason, he glances backward over the long, winding road philosophy has travelled to arrive at this point, at last, here in this quiet room with him. And so the book ends, not with triumph exactly, not with reason finally seizing hold of everything it once longed to know, the soul, the world entire, God himself, laid bare and certain upon the table, but with something humbler and in its own way more restful, with reason learning patiently, carefully, like a tired traveller finally lying down after a long and confusing day, exactly where its own proper home is, and exactly where the walls of that home must stand. Kant does not tell us the great old questions were foolish to ask. He tells us gently that they were natural, inevitable, almost beautiful in their reach, but that knowledge, real knowledge, the kind reason can actually stand behind with full confidence, only ever extends as far as possible experience can carry it, out to the soft edges of space and time, and not one single step further. Beyond that edge lies not nothing exactly, but a dim and quiet dark that theoretical reason must learn at last gracefully to leave alone, trusting instead, when it comes to God, freedom, and the soul, to something softer than proof, to hope, to moral faith, to the quiet, steady compass of practical reason, which does not need certainty in order to guide a good life well. And so the candle gutters, the fire settles into embers, and the old philosopher in Königsberg closes his book at last, having spent his whole long winter carefully drawing the map of a single mind, so that all the minds that came after his might finally know with something like peace where they stood, and where for now gently they must simply rest, sleep well, and in the end, this sleepy summary, with its relaxing tone and warm glow, is not meant to replace something. It is meant to honor and point toward a much larger light. It is offered with care, and with the genuine hope that something in tonight's listening finds its way into you as an invitation. The whole book is waiting. The real depth lives there, in every word they chose, and every story they told, and every quiet idea they let breathe across a full page. Let this be the beginning of something you carry forward in the light of an ordinary tomorrow. And if this lamp has helped you in some way, alike keeps it burning for someone else who might need it too.